What happens to you when you encounter a stressful situation? A lot happens, actually. Just speaking at a physiological level, the human body responds to stress by triggering a cascade of hormones in your brain that do everything from making your heart pound faster, breaking a sweat, and accelerating your breathing. And this is a reaction commonly referred to as fight or flight response. And it's meant to help you either fight off a threat or flee from it. And strangely, some people actually trigger this on purpose, especially this time of year, by watching scary movies and going to haunted houses. I'm looking at Dwayne if he's here. He dragged me to a haunted house once, never again. I generally avoid haunted houses because I usually lean towards the fight response. And one time in college, I came home from the library, because I did actually go to the library, and my roommate decided he would jump out and scare me. And I immediately punched him in the face with an armful of books. And I had never punched anyone in the face before, and he had never been punched in the face before, but we learned our lesson and we laughed it off. The fight or flight response doesn't just happen when you're scared, though. It can be triggered by any form of stress, including driving through traffic, having an argument, or scrambling to meet an upcoming deadline at work or at school, and much more. I'm not going to go through the whole list of triggers because that might be stressful in and of itself. But while it's commonly referred to as just fight or flight, it's now becoming more common to refer to it as fight, flight, or freeze. Sometimes you don't immediately go on the offensive or the defensive. Sometimes you do nothing at all. Many animals demonstrate this when they stop in their tracks or they play dead. That's why we refer to it as playing possum or the deer in the headlights look. It seems counterintuitive to freeze. But sometimes that's actually the best response, because then a predator won't see them or they'll lose interest. However, for humans, that may not always be the best response. If you are driving in traffic or having an argument, simply freezing may not be the best response for you. You might get into a lot of trouble. But there is something to be said about responding to stress by not doing anything, at least not for the moment. When those stress hormones start flooding, and when your heart starts racing, and when you start to panic, take a deep breath. Pause. Don't necessarily freeze, but be still. And when you get your bearings, you might find that what's causing you stress isn't really a threat or something that you need to be afraid of at all. Like, I don't know, maybe it's your college roommates. Sorry, Matt. One last scenario. How would you respond to the arguably quite stressful experience of seeing an army of Egyptian chariots led by an enraged pharaoh set to re-enslave you and your unarmed, vulnerable people? Well, if you haven't personally experienced that yourself, you can use your imagination as we consider the Exodus story today. See, our church is going through the story, which is a long series of lessons that's taking us all the way through the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. The story doesn't end there, though, but it continues on to today. This is our story, too. And understanding the overarching story of the Bible helps us to understand our place in the story, too. For this is our story. When we understand what God is doing in our lives today, we see that this is the story of deliverance. Last week we talked about Joseph, one of the great-grandsons of Abraham, who was sold into slavery by his brothers into Egypt. But through a series of events, he eventually became one of Pharaoh's deputy or lieutenant rulers. Now, God did not want Joseph to be enslaved, but God was able to redeem that tragedy by using it to save this family that God had promised would be a great nation. And it was there in Egypt that this nation would flourish and grow. 4 centuries passed, and Joseph was long forgotten at this point. Abraham's descendants were so numerous that they became a threat to the native Egyptians, who in response enslaved them and oppressed them with forced labor, because that's what humans do. But these humans weren't like any others. These were the people of God, and their God was with them, hearing their cries, hearing their prayers. God was going to deliver them out of their suffering, and God was going to do it through Moses. Now, this was a surprise to a lot of people, including Moses. Now, remember a couple of weeks ago when we talked about Abraham and how God continually uses unexpected and unqualified people to do God's work? Well, Moses is another example of that. First off, Moses was around 80 years old when he encountered God in the burning bush. Again, couldn't God have asked him 50 years earlier? And when God told him that he was being instructed to go to Pharaoh and to demand that God's people be set free, Moses had a whole lot of questions for God. He was asking, okay, what if this happens? And what if, how do I respond to this question if it comes up? And it's probably going to come up. And God answered every single one of Moses' questions until finally he said, look, you got the wrong guy. I am a terrible public speaker. Come on, find someone else. Well, I think most of you know that that's not how the story goes. Moses eventually relented. He went to Pharaoh, delivering this message from God, let my people go. Pharaoh refused. And he kept refusing until 10 plagues later. And after Egypt was devastated, God's people were finally able to leave Egypt after exactly 430 years to the day. They didn't have a whole lot of time to pack, but Moses made sure to bring the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph had made them swear an oath, saying, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. So 430 years later, those old bones were going home. Now, the Israelites didn't make it very far until Pharaoh changed his mind. He got into his chariot and he rode towards them with the might of his army, including 600 chariots and horses, kicking up a cloud of dust that the Israelites would have seen coming a mile away. They knew that the Egyptians were coming for them. And this triggered that fight or flight response. In Exodus chapter 14, beginning in verse 10, we read this. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and they were the Egyptians marching after them. And they were terrified. And they cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? Thanks. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. What the Israelites, when they saw this Egyptian army roaring towards them, their hearts started beating faster. They started sweating, their breath quickening. They started to cry out in fear because they believed they were about to die. They could try to fight, but they were no army. They would be easily trampled by the chariots, and they certainly couldn't outrun them. There was nowhere to go. So what were they going to do? Freeze? What would that do other than just stand by and accept their fate? And yet that's exactly what Moses told them to do. In verse 13, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Stand firm. Stand still. This suggestion from Moses may have seemed absolutely bonkers to the Israelites, but Moses was very clear in his reasoning. He was pointing up. Moses and all of the Israelites, all of the people in that moment, could only rely on God. The only way that they would prevail against the Egyptians would be by the strength and power of their God, for their God was mightier. Did they believe that? Did they have faith in the promise that was handed down to them, that was given to their ancestor Abraham, handed down from generation to generation, that God would be their God and that they would be God's people? Did they believe this? Did they believe that God was on their side, listening to their cries, answering their prayers? If they did, they needed to stop. Take a breath. Be still. And wait and see what God would do. What Moses was asking them to do was not to freeze, but to witness. Observe the strength and power of God, for God would do all the fighting. This was their deliverance story, but God was their deliverer. This would be a tale of victory, but the victory would solely belong to God. This wasn't an underdog story about how a ragtag team of Israelites defeated one of the greatest military powers in the ancient world. No, this would be a story of how the creator of the world had chosen a people to be an example of what God was able to do if humans would only obey God and believe. And God was protecting that people. And if you listen to God and faithfully live the way that God desires you to live, how God created you to live, then even miracles can happen. Seas can be parted. God told Moses to stretch out his hand, and when he did, a mighty wind blew, and the waters of the Red Sea were divided, so that the Israelites were able to cross on dry land. The Egyptians pursued them. God threw them into confusion, and he jammed the wheels of their chariots, causing them to shout out, "Let's get away from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." The Egyptians knew what was going on, but it was too late for them. Moses stretched out his hand. The waters of the Red Sea flowed back into place, sweeping the entire Egyptian army out into the sea. And just as Moses had said, the Israelites were never to see their oppressors ever again. God, their deliverer, had saved them, and all the Israelites had to do was stand and be still. The story of the Exodus is one of the most important stories in the Bible. We see it told and retold from generation to generation. There are references and echoes of Exodus throughout the rest of the Bible because it would stand as this constant reminder for God's people of what their God could do and would do for them. This wasn't a one-time thing. God would continue to win victory over victory, constantly delivering God's people over threats after threat that would face them. And they had a lot of threats coming up, which we'll see as we continue through the story. But every single time something stressful or scary happened to them that would trigger that fight or flight response, they would simply have to be still and remember that God was on their side. The God who delivered us out of Egypt will deliver us now. Israel would always need this reminder, and as God's people today, so do we. A couple of weeks ago marked the 25th anniversary of the death of Christian songwriter Rich Mullins. He wrote some of my favorite songs, some which we still sing here today, like Awesome God and Step by Step. And I've been listening to a lot of Rich Mullins' music lately, and as I was preparing this lesson, I considered his song, My Deliverer. Joseph took his wife and her child, and they went to Africa to escape the rage of a deadly king. There along the banks of the Nile, Jesus listened to the song that the captive children used to sing. And they were singing, my deliverer is coming, my deliverer is standing by. My deliverer is coming, my deliverer is standing by. And I love the way that Rich used his imagination to consider Jesus as a young boy. Growing up in Egypt, which he did after Joseph and Mary fled from King Herod. And what a reversal that centuries later they would go to Egypt for safety. You know, some of the songs that children sing today are centuries old. London Bridge fell down 1,000 years ago. So what if the songs that Jesus heard as a child were the same ones sung for generations and for generations? Parents and grandparents were whispering, singing, hoping, and praying, my deliverer is coming. This was a song for them, and this is a song for us. Our deliverer is coming. Our deliverer is standing by. Church, I don't know everything that you are facing today, but I know that some of you are facing a lot. There is so much to be stressed out about, so many threats to our well-being, so much that's overwhelming us and triggering that fight or flight or freeze response. But you don't have the strength to do any of that. You can't freeze either. You have to do something. And if that's you today, I'd like to ask you to do something right now. Let's do it together. Let's take a deep breath and let us be still. Our deliverer is coming. Can you say that with me? Our deliverer is coming. It is a hope and it is a prayer. Some of the best prayers in times of stress are what are called breath prayers. Maybe you've heard of them. They are very simple. They can be repeated. For example, inhale and say, let me be still and know that you are God. Let me be still and know that you are God. As we consider the story of the Bible and what God has done, consider your own story so far. Think about other stresses and threats and fears that you faced in the past. It could be related to health. It could be finances. It could be relationships. Maybe there have been times when you thought this was the end for you and that there was no way out. But if you're here today, it's because God made a way for you then. God parted the seas that were before you. God was with you then, and God is with you now. Your deliverer is coming. Your deliverer is standing by. The God who delivered Israel out of Egypt is delivering us still today. For this is the gospel that we are preaching, and the good news that we are proclaiming, not just with our words, but with our lives. We are living our deliverance stories. May the world know the power and might of our God, and may they know it firsthand. There are so many people out there in need of a deliverer. Are you one of them? If so, we would love to tell you more about Jesus and who he is and what he can do. You can be baptized and find your deliverance today. And if you're struggling right now, if you're stressed out, if you're overwhelmed, please know that you are not alone. Let us know, because we will love to pray with you, encourage you, be still with you, and listen. But know you're not alone. Come find me, one of our shepherds, one of our Stephen ministers, and we can do that today. But in all things, church, may God and God alone receive all glory and honor and praise. Amen.